that have been laid on that are never were used and cost a lot of money. I think one of the classic examples is the landing gear for the C-5. You know, C-5 had some spec to land in unimproved fields, which resulted in a very complex and very costly gear. And you know, one can never imagine landing a C-5 in anything other than a nice runway. So that sort of philosophy of be careful what you ask for, because everything you ask for is going to cost. And you can and nice to haves drive costs so high that the budget just won't afford them. And there are a certain set of requirements that you just cannot satisfy anywhere else except from space. You can do it better there than you can anywhere else. So what you need to do is to figure out what those requirements are and be as austere as you can, because it'll always be costly. To drive down cost to some degree, I think the increase in commercial use of space has to a great degree helped in driving down launch costs, and that'll continue to drive it. But the key is to drive them down as low and make it as simple as you can and still accomplish what you want to accomplish.
Jay Herther, I have a question on, it seems program development time takes a long time to get anything through from starter requirements to deployment. We talked about ways to save cost. We asked the panel, how can we shorten the time to go from starting a program to get something fielded quicker, more quickly? What are the techniques or what are the secrets to going faster and deployment?
Bucket and our camera. They were integrated, and then all of that met the Agena in an assembly building down at Vandenberg, and then it met the Thor and was launched. But the way the program was run, and I know Bob mentioned 13 failures. I know Corona had 13 failures. I didn't know whether you're adding 13 failures of Thor ahead of that.
Yeah, he was. He was talking about the research program.
But anyway, in the Corona program, there were 13 failures, and what the ground rule was basically we were going to fly once a month, and kind of the original assumption was there's a launch crew down in Vandenberg getting paid we're paying $500,000 a month, or the government is, whether they're launching or playing volleyball. And so we're going to launch sort of once a month. And what would happen is you'd launch one, fail, 1 week to kind of guess what happened, 1 week to decide and really nail it and start fixing it, a week to check it out, and then fly again. And that went on. Now, there were stretches in between, and I was running the test program on the camera because our problems were mainly film breakage and whatnot, and I was at the point where I was convinced the acetate that was a strip going between the supply and the take-up on the way up just dried out, and the minute they turned it on, this shattered like a glass light bulb. And Colonel Red Shepard, again, I've mentioned his name a couple of times, led a committee chaired by Din Land, and Colonel Oder will know exactly, he was certainly working for him on it, but they came through. I was convinced we couldn't do it, and the Air Force put an enormous pressure on Kodak. Kodak, to my mind, deserves an awful lot of credit for saving the program, because without that Mylar film, polyester film, without going to something that wouldn't dry out and break, that would have been curtains. I mean, to be honest with you, because we tested 2 or 3 cameras in vacuum chambers all over the Boston area, and we tried all kinds of gimmicks of creeping it and this and that, and it just was not on as a practical solution. But again, we went through the 1 a month series, and finally on 13 we got one recovered that was a flag. And ironically, the security was so secure that I think Moose Matheson was rushed out to get it off of wherever he picked it up, Moose Matheson. And the ground rule was you had to destroy it. It's so classified, you got to destroy the capsule and all that. So the very first capsule that came back from space, Moose destroyed the damn thing. They substituted another one. And then you see pictures of President Eisenhower pulling a flag out of it. That had nothing to do with what this is all kind of, cult.
Well, thank you very much, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, members of Air Force Space Command. It's a delight to have you here with us today. It's an important day for Air Force Space Command. It's an important day for us to recognize these wonderful folks here, the pioneers that are a part of our team, and those who will soon, here in the next few minutes, become the class of 2003. And having had dinner with them last night, I'll tell you, they were really a class group, that's for sure. So, and I'm glad that Mike came to back you up here, so it's good to have you with you. So I'm pleased to have the opportunity to stand here with you today and help with this wonderful ceremony to recognize these great individuals. You know, it's especially significant. This is the 100th anniversary of Powered Flight that we gather together here and celebrate pioneers just like the Wright brothers, who share in the rich tradition and the rich history of the exploration of the medium of air and space. And then, unlike the Wright brothers, though, our space pioneers have only recently begun to be recognized. And we think it's about time that we do that. And we've just started recently under a revised program. I'll tell you just a little bit more about that. The award that we're about to present today was first given by the National Space Club of Washington, D.C. in 1989.
Citation to accompany the 2003 Air Force Space and Missile Pioneers Award. The 2003 Air Force Space and Missile Pioneers Award is presented to Mr. John C. Herther in recognition of his significant accomplishments in the advancement of space and missile programs in the Air Force. Mr. John C. Herther made significant contributions to the development of satellite stabilization, guidance, and control during the early years of the Air Force's space program. In May 1955, First Lieutenants Herther and Malcolm R. Malcolmson co-authored a classified thesis titled A Transition Control System. Their study, which proposed placing a satellite in a 300-mile circular orbit by means of an inertial reference computer-controlled thruster fired at apogee, would become the foundation for ascent guidance and on-orbit stabilization of Lockheed's Agena spacecraft. Upon receiving a Master of Science degree from MIT, Lieutenant Herther reported to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, as the Guidance and Control Officer on the embryonic Advanced Reconnaissance Systems Satellite Project, MX-2226, formerly designated Project 1115 and later Weapon System 117L. When the satellite program transferred to Western Development Division in early 1956, Lieutenant Herther moved with it and worked initially on the Atlas booster interface. His responsibilities grew to include integration of the design of the Agena with Atlas, as well as engineering of the Agena airframe, propulsion, and guidance and control subsystems on Weapon System 117L. After leaving the service in December 1957, he went to work for the recently formed iTech Corporation and finalized a concept using Horizon sensors for gas jet on-orbit stabilization of the proposed Corona Discoverer reconnaissance satellite. At a key briefing in early 1958, he convinced CIA decision makers to consider the high potential of an iTech 3-axis stabilized camera concept based on work he had done on the Weapon System 117L vehicle while with the Air Force. By mid-1958, iTech had won the subcontract for the Corona camera system, and Mr. Herther turned his attention to the short-lived Air Force Samos E-5 that evolved into the NRO's simplified E-5 or Lanyard satellite program. He remained with iTech until February 1969, working on a variety of optics-related projects, including one to develop a large mapping lens and prototype camera for NASA. Over the years, hundreds of United States Air Force, NASA, and other payloads would orbit successfully using Mr. Herther's 3-axis stabilization. In recognition of those accomplishments and many others, Air Force Space Command has selected Mr. John C. Herther as a recipient of the 2003 Air Force Space and Missile Pioneers Award.
This is the American space program that you know. Mercury, Gemini, Apollo. The familiar names of the pioneering efforts that eventually put men on the moon. But there was another space program you weren't told about. It was called Corona, and it was the world's first spy satellite. From 1960 to 1972, Corona took pictures that laid bare the secrets of the communist world. Born in the era of vacuum tubes and computer punch cards, Corona was a landmark accomplishment in engineering and espionage. Land and his team suggested a short-term solution, building a controversial Lockheed design called the U-2. The Air Force had commissioned the high-flying plane, but they later rejected it because it couldn't carry guns or bombs. Now the U-2 would be manufactured and fitted with a powerful new camera and high-resolution film. But it would not be controlled by the Air Force.
At that time, Eisenhower had two institutions whose mission was security. One, the Air Force, and the CIA. Both of them were institutionally incapable of doing this job, the U-2. And I'll say the follow-on of the satellite. When I'm talking U-2, I'm talking overflight, U-2 satellite. When those two institutions, each of which alone was incapable of doing this, were brought together, we had two negatives make a positive. It created the U-2 and the follow-on reconnaissance satellite effort. The Air Force provided support, and the CIA, which really wasn't in the hardware business at all, carried the ball, and under Bissell did a fantastic job.
At this point, balloons rose again as a reconnaissance option, this time under the name Weapon System 461L. Built around a powerful camera designed by optical physicist Walter Levison, 461L was an order of magnitude improvement in photographic quality for aerial spying. The camera could take sharp photos of wide areas of terrain from altitudes near the edge of the Earth's atmosphere, twice as high as previous balloon cameras. In 1958, after months of delays, 3 461L balloons were launched off an aircraft carrier into the jet stream. Unfortunately, the launches had been delayed, and someone forgot to reset the balloon's timers. All 3 payloads dropped into communist territory. Eisenhower was livid. The Air Force had guaranteed him that this new surveillance program would be undetectable. Now the president had an international incident on his hands. 461L was quickly canceled. But the elegance of Walter Levison's camera was noted by Polaroid's Dr. Land. It would quickly be put to new use. In October of 1957, the Soviet Union put the first man-made satellite into space. Soviet spokesman pointedly noted that the same rockets that sent Sputnik into orbit could easily send missiles to any part of the world. Sputnik set off a near panic in the United States. Politicians charged that America was lagging behind Soviet technology, and if action wasn't taken soon, the West would fall victim to a missile gap. Made considerable progress designing a spacecraft called the Agena that would carry the TV camera into orbit. But Dr. Land, who stepped in to review the effort, decided that 117L was years away from delivering crystal-clear pictures. Remembering the powerful optics of Levison's balloon camera, Land convinced Eisenhower that his new goal should be to put a similar camera into space, let it take pictures, then bring the exposed film back down to Earth for developing. The Thor rocket and the upper stage Agena spacecraft developed for 117L would be retooled for this new mission. It was a bold, quick, and relatively cheap solution. Eisenhower said yes, and a new satellite was born. It was given the code name Corona. The task facing Lockheed's engineers was daunting. At a time when American rockets could barely get off the ground, They had to put a finely calibrated machine into outer space and control its actions once it got there. The goal was to put a Corona satellite into polar orbit around the Earth. Once there, the satellite's camera would be turned on and off as areas of interest passed by underneath. The capsule needed to be stable on all three axes. In other words, instead of spinning like a top, it had to stay level like an airplane or a balloon, always keeping its lens pointed at the Earth. Corona's film would spin from the back of the satellite, through the camera, and into a take-up reel crammed into the nose of the spacecraft. When all the film was exposed, the spacecraft would eject a bucket filled with spy film back down to the Pacific Ocean. To carry off this high-risk plan, Eisenhower again turned to the CIA. Richard Bissell, now a rising star at the agency following the success of the U-2, added Corona to his list of responsibilities. Bissell applied the same tight security restrictions here that he established for the U-2. For Air Force coordination, Bissell turned to General Osmond Ritland, his deputy on the U-2 program. Ritland set up a covert or black Corona office, then hid it inside a mild-mannered space research program called Discoverer. Colonel Lee Battle ran the day-to-day operations of the so-called Discoverer program. At first, only Battle, his deputies, and one office worker knew the satellite's secret identity. Lockheed built the spacecraft, but a company called iTech built its contents, the first space-based spy camera. iTech was co-founded by Richard Leghorn, former head of Air Force Reconnaissance Research. One of iTech's key employees was Walter Levison, the designer of the 461L balloon camera. Now, Levison and a team of engineers wrestled with the challenge of building a precision instrument that could function in outer space.
I think anyone who knows anything about a camera is the worst thing that can happen is that you move the camera when you're taking a picture. And basically the problem is the same up there. While you are taking the picture, everything has to be standing still as far as you're concerned. Now, you take into account the fact that you are going 18,000 miles an hour through the area by what they call image motion compensation. And that's basically tracking the image with the camera system. But some changes can be so subtle, you can't really identify what you've done. But if it works out, you better leave it alone and stick with it.
Eisenhower was very clear as this went along. He said when I would report to him another failure of the so-called Discoverer satellite, he would say, don't worry about it. We're going to stay with this thing. We're going to bring it through because it's something that we really need. And he was committed to it and very steady in his support.
Finally, Eisenhower's patience was rewarded. With Discoverer 13, the Air Force and Lockheed managed to put a camera into orbit and turn it on and off. The payload bucket was ejected right on schedule, though this test mission didn't carry any film. The falling capsule eluded the recovery planes that hoped to snatch it from midair. The bucket splashed down 300 miles northwest of Hawaii, where it was retrieved by a Navy helicopter. An encrypted message was immediately sent to Richard Bissell at the CIA. It read simply, "Capsule recovered undamaged." The Air Force, Lockheed, and their shadowy partners in the intelligence community could now breathe a sigh of relief. The months of embarrassing failures seemed to be over. Discoverer 14 was the first mission where everything worked correctly. The Corona camera took its pictures, the film bucket was shot back to Earth, then the bucket was successfully snagged in midair. But recovery crews were kept in the dark about the bucket's true identity.
I think that everyone speculated on what it was, and of course that speculation was never discussed among people, and it was in the newspapers, and you know, all this kind of stuff, what are big spy satellites and things like that.
Technical problems continued to dog Corona over the next few years. But from the very first missions, Corona photographs opened up the secret world of the Soviet Union to an extent that CIA analysts could only dream of in the 1950s. Photo interpreters began the laborious but critical process of mapping and studying every square foot of China, the Soviet Union, and their client states. Within just a few years, the U.S. went from having only vague knowledge of communist strength to knowing the precise deployment of Soviet and Chinese forces.
It was revolutionary. In fact, imagery, in a sense, is what set the United States intelligence community apart in the world during the 1960s in particular. But almost no one can get into a denied area, and with remote sensing, basically count the forces and develop the anatomy of the threat that's facing them. That was an American specialty until fairly recently.
By the mid-60s, the quality of Corona imagery had improved dramatically. Resolution quality, the sharpness of objects in a photo, went from 25 feet to 6 feet in a handful of years. Corona data had already proved that fears of Soviet ICBM superiority were unfounded, though the photos also proved that the USSR was building up its forces in all areas, from atom bombs to chemical weapons. Chinese activity was also closely monitored, and by studying force-level buildups along their borders, analysts were able to watch the tension mount between the USSR and China throughout the 1960s. Later, President Nixon was able to leverage both communist nations against each other in the pursuit of détente.
It did pioneer the recovery of payloads from space, high-performance imagery in space, three-axis stabilization of camera or of space systems, all of which were absolutely vital. If they hadn't been done in Corona, they would eventually have been done some other way. But this was really the very fastest and the cheapest way to do it, even though there were an even dozen failures, so-called failures, where no film was returned with imagery on it, yet at a cost of $7 million or so per launch, $850 million for the 145 launches, as I recall. That was a cheap price to pay.
Corona was the first successful U.S. space program, and it managed to outlive NASA's Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs as well. By 1972, when the last and final Corona satellite was launched, Americans had already wearied of men walking on the moon. But Corona's long-term legacy extended far beyond its technical accomplishments.
You know, we all felt a part of something that was going on that was terribly important to national defense and to national policy. And there was not the usual squabbling between contractors, and there was not the usual squabbling between agencies. You know, the CIA and the Air Force got along. And we were all working for what appeared to be a very important end goal. And we all felt pretty good about that.
Space and missile pioneers, people who are directly responsible for the development of many of the programs and systems with which we work today. What we have in front of us here, ladies and gentlemen, today is a national treasure, a wealth of knowledge and experience, probably some scar tissue too, of folks who we literally stand on the shoulders of in this command for the great work that they did, the pioneering work that they did, and hence the title of their Space and Missile Pioneers for this great command.
Ask you, does this man look like he's 94? If we could all be so lucky.
Rick, I'd like to make one more comment pertinent to the current Space Command and what you guys are doing. In the abstract of the paper that you may or may not want to look up, it's I make a rather bold statement that after I left the NRO work, and for whatever Bill King had in mind, Jim Coolbaugh, another pioneer, and I started a company. And our idea was to solve the problem of plotting on radars on ships to avoid collisions. We thought computers would be a natural. So we developed the first fully automatic radar analyzer that fed data to another computer that displayed 40 vectors on top of a radar display.